This series of podcasts is taken from a weekly book study group. The book under discussion is entitled Select English Poems by contemporary Indian philosopher A. Parthasarathy. It explores some of the key concepts of the ancient philosophy of Vedanta. The book contains 20 poems in all. This series comprises several of these. The discussion is led by myself, Glenn Callahan of Vedanta Institute, Los Angeles. Links to the websites of both the author as well as Vedanta Institute LA can be found in the description. They are respectively vedantaworld.org and vedantala.org. The poem currently under discussion is The Mountain and the Squirrel by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The mountain and the squirrel had a quarrel, and the former called the latter Little Prig. Bun replied, "You are doubtless very big, but all sorts of things and weather must be taken in together to make up a year and a sphere. And I think it no disgrace to occupy my place. If I'm not so large as you, you are not so small as I, and not half so spry. I'll not deny you make a very pretty squirrel track. Talents differ. All is well and wisely put. If I cannot carry forests on my back, neither can you crack a nut." Ralph Waldo Emerson. So as with all of these poems, the theme is highlighted in italics. So the theme of this one is talents differ. All is well and wisely put. If I cannot carry forests on my back, neither can you crack a nut. So this first aspect, all is well and wisely put. So one of the ways that this is often spoken about is it's like a jigsaw. Or another way he puts it is like an orchestra. So everything has been, as it were, orchestrated. So when we use this idea of an orchestra, you have 100-odd different people with their different talents, with their different instruments, all doing their different things. When they all do their different things, you get this beautiful melody. It all fits together in a way to provide something of immense beauty. Same with the jigsaw puzzle. You have all of these different pieces, all doing their different things, as it were, with their different shades and different colours and everything else. When you put them together, you get this beautiful picture. So it's the question that we sometimes ask, what's the most important piece in a puzzle? The one that's missing. That's the most important one, because without it, the jigsaw puzzle is incomplete. If one person in the orchestra is flat by half a semitone, the whole thing sounds off. Doesn't matter which instrument it is, or if one person's out of time. So what he's saying here is that there's this beautiful orchestration. So in the commentary he says, the universe is a composite whole of the animate and the inanimate. Both have distinct roles to play to sustain the world. None more or less important, they serve as spokes in a wheel. God acts as a hub, holding them all together. So this idea of God acting as a hub, holding them all together. So there's this plan of nature, right? This is the phrase that he uses in the VT to describe this idea. So when we talk about a plan of nature, one of the things that we must understand it does not mean that the score has been written for us. It doesn't mean that there are certain experiences or events that are predetermined or predestined to take place. This idea of a plan of nature, one of the ways that we can best illustrate it is by looking at the example that we always give. You cut yourself, immediately the plan of nature functions to heal. It brings it back into balance. It always has a particular direction. The body's always moving in the direction of health, no matter what you do to it. And even right up until the point that the physical body dies, even up until that point, the body is still moving in the direction of health. It's just that at that point, the physical energies and everything else just don't have the strength to carry that task out. But it's always going in the same direction. So this is what we can understand by this plan of nature. It doesn't refer to external agency predetermining events or experiences. So this is the idea of something outside of the orchestra. So we posit something that is beyond the orchestration. So the world is the orchestra. Everything that we see, as he said in the commentary, the animate and the inanimate. Now, when it comes to animals, animals is a good example because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the freedom, as it were, to function against the plan of nature. Everything that an animal does is perfect. It may be irritating, it may be destructive, it may cause significant pain and suffering to other animals or even to humans. But it's always perfect. They are unable to deviate from that plan. Human beings have this degree of freedom where we are able to deviate from the plan of nature. When we do so, this is the functioning of the ego. So it's the ego or the individuality that claims a special, individualized existence and then functions only from that basis. So one of the things he often talks about is this notion of attuning to the plan of nature and then functioning. So recognizing that we are part of a larger whole and then functioning on that basis. So again, the orchestra is a good example there. I'm not just a bassoon player or a violin player or a French horn or whatever it happens to be. I'm part of something much larger than that, and I play my part to ensure the melody of the orchestra. Same sort of idea. If I consider myself to be, or if I only take the perspective of my own individual existence, what that means is I have neglected to recognize the larger whole of which I am a part. What that means is I'll function as an independent unit. So I can then function against this plan of nature. So this is one of the ways that the ego starts to function. Once we have this involvement in and attachment to our own individual perspective, what that means is that we will naturally tend to succumb to complexes. So when we talk about complexes, we talk about superiority complex and inferiority complex. So when we hear about superiority complex, this is a fairly intuitively clear notion of how an ego functions. You find someone who is wealthy or powerful, physically strong or physically beautiful, popular or very smart or whatever it happens to be, or they have some sort of political or social power. They have their own skills, they have their own talents. A person with a superiority complex values those things in and of themselves and then claims to be better than others. So again, it's this whole idea of making the whole story all about me. Look at what I have, look at what I have achieved, look at what I can do. I'm better. So this is a very easily understood way of understanding a superiority complex, just being better than others. When we see someone with an inferiority complex, sort of a self-pitying, poor me, I can't do anything right, I'm stupid, no one likes me, or this kind of idea. Our heart tends to go out to those people, and it should, but we don't necessarily recognize in the same way that it's as much an expression of the ego as the superiority complex, because it's for the same reasons. They are looking at their own functioning, their own qualities only, but the difference is here that they've measured them against the external environment or compared themselves to other people and recognized themselves as being less. So the superiority complex compares and sees I'm better. The inferiority compares and sees I'm worse. But in both cases, the person's sense of self-worth, their self-esteem, their sense of place in the world is dependent upon their qualities and how they relate to the external world. And it's a balancing act. One of the things I've heard Swamiji say a number of times, he says, just about everybody is subject to inferiority or superiority. Nobody escapes. He says people start with an inferiority complex and try to get themselves out of it. They swing past and they get to superiority complex. Then they go back again and you get this sort of seesaw. Inferiority, superiority, inferiority, superiority. Ultimately, the whole process of fixing the problem is addressing the cause. What is the cause of that ego? So it's our ignorance which causes the ego. So one of the ways that we can understand that is what this philosophy is saying is that we are part of a much larger whole. There is an orchestrated melody of existence. There's no such thing as an individual. We can talk about an individual for purposes of discussion in the same way that you can talk about your liver cell for the purposes of discussion, but it doesn't exist on its own. It exists only within the framework of the entire organ of the liver. And you can take it further. We can talk about your liver. For the purposes of discussion, your liver has been, damaged by too much alcohol. But your liver only exists within the context of your physical personality. Same idea. We talk about me as an individual human being. For the purposes of discussion, it makes sense. But I, as an individual human being, only exists within a much broader context. So that is the truth that this philosophy is trying to bring out to us. When we are ignorant of that truth, what we say is real is only what we have available to our perception. The only thing that I have available to me is my perceptions, my emotions, my thoughts, my subjective experience. So because that's all I know, I claim that's all there is to know. So I am ignorant of the fact that I am intimately connected to this orchestrated existence. If I eradicate that ignorance, which means taking in knowledge, then the notion of being an individual existence naturally starts to dissolve. You start to recognize that there will be someone who is number one in Forbes' rich list, in the greatest tennis player, in the highest IQ, in all of the different fields of human endeavor. There's someone who's the best, and there's someone who is the worst. And between those two extremes is everybody else. This dependency upon being in a particular place is an expression of the ego, and it's the cause of so much of our mental anxiety. This constant drive to compare ourselves with others. It's a natural human tendency, but this is where things like technology and social media, as an example, have exacerbated the problem. When we walk out of the house in the morning, we all presumably check the mirror first. How's my hair look? Do I have food on my face? How does my clothing look? We want to present ourselves in a way which is well presented. Of course we do. But we can take that one step further. So when you look at something like a social media profile, the only thing that we put on there is that thing that we want others to see of us at our best. I was listening to, must have been NPR, and they were talking to a social psychologist, I presume she was, talking about this increased incidence of depression, especially amongst teenagers. Part of the reason that they're attributing it to is this idea that the moment you look at another person's social media profile, what do you see? You see them at their most beautiful, at their most fun-loving, at their most successful. And so there's a natural tendency to think, well, that's what that person's life is. We compare ourselves to that and feel a sense of social anxiety or depression. This is the ego functioning. So you can't blame social media for the problem. Social media has exacerbated it, but the problem rests in this whole notion of an egocentric sense of being dependent upon one's own qualities, being a particular way. So the question is then, how do you start to dissolve this dependency? And this is exactly what he talks about here. Talents differ. All is well and wisely put. So there is an orchestration. It's all well and wisely put. Everybody has different qualities and properties, different levels of skill at different things. It has to be the case. It cannot be any other way. The moment you start to recognize that, then wherever you happen to slot in, You say, okay, well, this is my place. And if you happen to be mediocre, objectively mediocre, if you're a tennis player, you're not even on the ATP rankings, you don't have a sense of dependency upon being anywhere else. You understand, in fact, I heard someone glibly summarize Stoicism. When something bad happens, the tendency is to bemoan it and say, well, why me? The Stoic says, why not me? Why shouldn't I be the one who gets my car stolen? Why shouldn't I be the one who contracts the disease? Why shouldn't I be the one whose wife leaves me? It has to happen to someone. Why would I think that it's not going to happen to me? So what this is pointing to is a much larger functioning of existence outside of our own specific dependencies. So the way to start to gain an understanding of that is through this poem. The way that we defuse some of these egocentric notions is through knowledge. Talents differ. All is well and wisely put. If I cannot carry forest on my back, neither can you crack a nut. So what he's saying here is that each person has their own specific tendencies and properties and things that they are good at in varying degrees. Everybody has their own place. I think it no disgrace to occupy my place. Well, what is my place? My place is bang on the average. That's my place. Now, it's important that we understand that this idea is not a justification for the absence of striving. These ideas can be appropriated by the ego and misused. So if a person has a sort of tamasic tendency, if a person has a tendency to sort of be lazy and complacent, then it may use this idea and say, well, I'm only average, so hey, but someone's got to be average, why not me? And so that can translate into justifying their sense of laziness, complacency, procrastination. No, it doesn't mean that at all. Part of what we learn or what we're discovering in these ideas is that it is our obligation to function according to our nature to the best of our ability. It's human nature to progress. In the Vedanta treatise, he talks about this. He talks about the scope of spiritual education. He says the scope of spiritual education is that it should improve agriculture and technology, it should make our actions more dynamic, our emotions more pure, and our thinking more clear and independent. So what he's alluding to here is the notion that human life is progress. We have to progress. So whatever our qualities, properties, and tendencies are, we should always be looking to enhance them, but without the dependency upon getting to a particular place. So the example that we always or often use to illustrate this idea is the weekend tennis player. So if tennis is your hobby, you're always going to try and get better at it. But you don't care particularly where you are. You don't particularly care what your current status is. But you'll always be trying to get better. If you play an instrument, you don't play in a band, you're not trying to make money out of it, you're not trying to gain the adulation of your peers because of your skill, you just like playing it, it's your hobby. And so you practice every day, even sometimes when you don't want to, because you know this is the thing that I do, so it's part of my nature to get better at it. But there's no dependency upon getting to a particular place. Someone's got to be an average musician. There's nothing wrong with competition. By all means, you should want to beat your opponents. Be better than others. That's, again, part of your goal. Again, go back to the example of the tennis player. This is why I sort of use both, because one is a competition. When you get onto the tennis court, you do everything you can to beat your best friend whom you're playing. You exploit his weaknesses. You know he's not the fastest, so you get him running as much as you can, or he tires easily, and you use your strength. So you're always trying to beat the opposition, as it were. There's nothing wrong with competition. The only thing we're talking about here is trying to reduce and ultimately eliminate the dependency upon being in a particular place. So if you know that you have a tendency for this result orientation, if I don't win or if I'm not at the top, then I'm going to be dissatisfied. Inferiority complex. I'm no good. If you know you have a tendency for that result orientation, avoiding competition is not going to change it. The fact that you avoid competition doesn't mean that you're going to reduce your tendency for result orientation. It will simply find another way somewhere else. Having said that, you may also choose to create environments that don't exacerbate it beyond a point. So why do I play tennis? Why do I play my instrument? Well, because it's part of my nature to do this. So you do it, you understand what you're doing it for. Well, the whole idea of being caught up in our qualities and properties is that we've lost sight of the thing that lies beyond the activity. When you're playing tennis with your friends on the weekend, you've never lost sight of the idea that it's a social activity, it's part of my hobby, it's part of keeping fit, it's part of having fun, it's just a game. You never lose sight of that when it's part of your hobby. If you're out on the weekend playing tennis with your friends and someone genuinely gets upset because they lost, that person has lost sight of it. And we point to this. What do we say to that person who throws down his racket, John McEnroe style? Mate, it's just a game. It's just a game. He has lost sight of that. So avoiding the scenarios that will allow our result orientation to express, in and of itself is not going to help anything. What is going to help is understanding, first of all, how the ego functions in this way. It's a dependency upon achieving certain things. The second is to recognize that there is this orchestration. It's a blend, as it were, of both the intellect and the mind, the thinking and the feeling. It's a feeling of something much larger than us, something much larger than ourselves. There's a natural flow of life, of material. It talks about the five metamorphic changes: birth, growth, disease, decay, and death. He talks about the day passing through, morning, noon, evening, night, etc. There's a constant flow going on. I'm just part of it. So it's a feeling of being a part of something larger. The ego cuts that feeling off. And we feel ourselves and we function as an independent unit. That's what causes the sense of dissatisfaction and the suffering. So the other examples he gives to sort of illustrate this idea of an orchestration, you look at a university and you look at the proportion of different degrees that people are studying. So the maximum number of people may be studying, say, a business degree. Slightly fewer than that, you might have people in engineering. Slightly fewer than that, you might have people in the hard sciences. Fewer than that, pure mathematics. Fewer than that, philosophy. So there's a natural sort of ratio. Who maintains it? Where does it come from? Why is it that way? So this is something that is socially constructed. Then he gives another example of things that are not socially constructed. He talks about the ratio of vegetation to herbivores, herbivores to carnivores. There is a natural balance. Why is it the way that it is? Why is that ratio that and not something else? So this is the idea of that plan of nature, or God as the hub that holds the spokes together. So the philosopher is the one who is less interested in what the laws are. Why is it 9.81 meters per second squared and not 10.5? Okay, the number is less relevant than why things are the way they are. What's behind it? What's beyond it? So this is the idea again of the idea of something that is transcendent. when we keep questioning in this way, ultimately we get to some point where we say, I don't know. Aha. So what the philosopher does, what the spiritual person does, is to posit something that itself is not subject to laws, but which, as it were, maintains or is responsible for the laws the way they are. So this is the idea of a God or a transcendental. And the notion of the absolute, which is another word for it, is important because what it does, it allows us to view the expression from outside it. Right? In the same way that these ideas are allowing us to view our ego from outside it. At the moment, we're caught up in our ego. Right? We're within it, like a bubble that's around us. And so everything that comes to us through the ego. What these ideas allow us to do is to conceptually, at least, step outside of that. So if throughout my daily life, when I'm functioning, in all my situations, work, family, social, etc., if I'm functioning as an independent unit, that's how I live my life, I take some time out. I adopt a study of philosophy. That gives me an hour a day or more, whatever, to view my life from the perspective of outside of that ego. Now, whether we accept the idea of a God or a transcendent or a transcendental is irrelevant. We don't have to accept anything. Right? This is the difference between philosophy and religion, or religion as it's practiced, I should say. Religion as it's practiced demands that you accept the notion of God. If you don't believe in the Christian God, you're not a Christian. If you don't believe in the Muslim God, you're not a Muslim. So there's a sort of a demand of a certain belief. Philosophy doesn't do that. Philosophy just presents ideas for us to think about. It's playing with ideas in a sense. So it's very liberal. We're inquiring just because we want to understand. There's no requirement to actually believe anything. In fact, it's quite the other way around. We are required not to believe it until it makes sense to us to do so. So where a religion becomes dogmatic, where there is an orthodoxy to which we must adhere, philosophy says you must not adhere to orthodoxy, you must not adhere to dogmatism, you must not believe anything until you yourself have come to accept it. And this is where the freedom comes in. Once we have started to view the world in a different way, that releases us from our earlier notions. So the notion that I am this individual existence and nothing more, that determines how I experience my world, it determines everything that I give, every action that I make. I spend some time, I spend years, thinking from a different perspective, thinking from the perspective of I'm just a piece in the puzzle, I'm just an instrument in the orchestra. I think about these things, I feel them this way. That'll start to change the way that I experience my world. It'll start to change the way that I respond back into it. When these beliefs improve that, then we may choose to hold on to them. The other thing that happens is that we develop a natural spirit of cooperation. The idea of functioning as an independent unit essentially means that whatever my interests are, they are primary. So in the Vedanta treatise, he gives different expressions of ego. One of those is, I alone exist. So essentially what that means is that my interests are the only interests that matter. Or to even go further than that, my interests are the only interests that actually exist. And so what that means is all of my actions are dedicated only to serving my own interests. The moment I start to recognize that there's some sort of orchestrated melody of existence, I'm not the only one functioning here. We not only start to feel ourselves as part of a greater whole, but we want to act on that basis. And this bleeds into every area of life. So it might seem that the philosophical ideas are interesting, but not particularly practical. But it's eminently practical. The moment you start to feel this, and the moment you start to understand this sense of being part of something larger, when you go into, say, your workplace, you take that understanding and you apply it to your workplace. And so what that means is that I will be naturally inclined to also advance the interests of others. This is where cooperation comes from. When we talk about cooperation, we often talk about the expression of it in terms of being, how do I act in this world? Well, I act to help others achieve a particular goal. That's not cooperation in its truest sense. Cooperation in its truest sense is a recognition that nothing can be achieved by oneself. That's cooperation. It's understanding. Whatever output I claim to have created, I no longer see myself as the author of it. I might see myself as perhaps the penultimate cause. Without me, I could not have written this book. I could not have written this song. I could not have created this sculpture, whatever it happens to be. But there's a huge number of individuals, streams of causation, prior knowledge, pre-existing contexts. All of these things went into this final product. And so when that recognition happens, there is a natural tendency to want to cooperate with others. So you can't force cooperation. You can't fake it. It's a natural expression when we have correctly understood certain aspects of human life.